There you go. Okay. Resilience.
Resilience is about elasticity of the operations of the status quo. Entirely conservative. There's multiple categorical variants of resilience, from descriptive to normative, engineering, disaster, community, ecological, socio-ecological, urban. And by that normative, there's some that describe existing phenomenon or capacities, some variants or definitions, and there's some that are more aspirational, that are about the future states. And they vary quite a bit. But I think in terms of, and they have various degrees of analytical prowess and capacity, but ultimately, in the United States at least, when we say resilience, we largely mean disaster resilience or engineering resilience, a sort of reversion post-recovery to the status quo.
Status quo.
Inherently, resilience speaks to the preservation of the status quo. And there's nothing wrong with that under certain conditions, but that can also work to perpetuate poverty traps. There's many things that are quite deleterious in society that have quite high levels of resilience. And so I think we need to question for ourselves the extent to which the preservation of existing authorities and institutions of power is really serving our long-term adaptation and our long-term civil values and goods. And in many cases, if we don't challenge the institutions that define our vulnerability in the first place, then we will never fully have the capacity to adapt. And if we perpetuate resilience as an absolute good, we will be blind to those institutions and asymmetries of power that dictate the present delineations of our own vulnerabilities and our own weaknesses.
Adaptation.
Adaptation is largely about the incremental, transitional transformation from one domain to another. It's most often understood as a process, not an outcome, and is most often oriented towards adaptive capacity. That is a range of capacities that speak to the capacity of a host, an object, a system to be able to transform and change either function or identity from one domain to the other. Adaptive capacity is the ability or capacity to incorporate and utilize not just internal designs for known risks, but to actually have the capacity to utilize external designs for unknown risks, hazards, and perturbations.
Maladaptation.
Maladaptation is our understanding that perhaps, well, it may not be an understanding, it may not be fully evaluated, but only in retrospective terms, but it is largely a series of processes, emergent or otherwise, that are perhaps intended to be in the name of adaptation, but ultimately from a, let's say, collective point of view or from a different frame of reference in terms of beneficiaries is likely quite deleterious and heading in the wrong direction. So that very often we set up things that serve resilience in the short term, but may actually be maladaptive in the long term, and vice versa. So, for instance, some things that require adaptation may long-term transformation adaptation may mean undermining resilience in the short or near term.
Climate gentrification.
Climate gentrification is a theory of explaining how certain processes in markets and consumer behaviors and preferences lead to disruption and displacement in communities adjacent to varying ranges and degrees of environmental exposure, as well as an underlying capacity for either resilience or adaptation in those adjacent built environment. So these three pathways, the superior investment pathway, the cost burden pathway, and the resilience investment pathway, all operate to describe certain phenomena that we would anticipate with climate gentrification.